way. It is a right given to us. There are many other rights. One of them, even more broad and all-encompassing, is the right to obedience. We all have the right to obey what God has told us to do. In particular, if you're a Christian, you've been given the Great Commission to go and to make disciples of all the nations by, number one, proclaiming the Lord Jesus Christ so that you can baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Spirit, and by teaching to obey all that Christ has commanded. We have the right to obedience because we have the obligation to obedience. You actually see that in Acts chapter 5, a text that you know you don't need to turn there. We've talked about this text before. This is when several of the apostles were arrested and they're stood before the high priest. And the high priest says, "We gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name, and yet you fill Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us." And Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than man." We have the right to obedience because we have the obligation to obedience. It's all true. But we have to go deeper. Man has rights only because God has rights. Man has rights only because God has rights. So you need to follow the logical progression. God's rights are what produce in man obligations. And man, before he has rights, man has obligations. And it is man's obligations that then result in or produce rights. So if we build that out a little bit more, we could say it this way. God, by virtue of the fact that he is the creator and owner and sustainer, has the right to be obeyed and worshiped. God has the right to be obeyed and worshiped by everything he has created. And everything that he has created that has refused to obey and worship will suffer the righteous wrath of God for failing to give him his due. God has the right to be obeyed and worshiped. Man, therefore, has the obligation to obey and worship God. Because God has the right to be obeyed, man has the obligation to obey and to worship, and therefore, man has the right to obey and worship. No other entity can come into contact with man and prohibit his worship and obedience of God. No other entity has the authority to prohibit that. Now, we've talked in weeks past, power and authority are not the same thing. There are some who have the power, the ability to restrain man from doing what he's supposed to do, but they don't have the authority. Nobody in the heavens or on the earth has the authority to prohibit man from obeying and worshiping God. Because God has that right produces in man an obligation, and because man has that obligation, man then has the right. And we know this, we just don't normally think in these terms. Consider a text we've looked at previously, Matthew 22, verse 21, when they try to trap Jesus and say, "Should we pay a poll tax to Caesar?" And what does Jesus say? "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's." And we pause there and we are reminded that that word render means to pay back what is owed or to give what is due. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's. Pay back to God. Give to God what is owed. Jesus affirms this very thing. This is not merely a New Testament